So in this next part, they're going to do 3 yes or no questions, and then we're going to reach into the magic hat, and they're going to pull a question in which I will read, and then they will give a, here's my time, 2-minute response. Sorry.
Don't show everyone your code.
I thought I had taken it. There.
Thank you.
Okay, first, do you think a proposed income tax on high Seattle earners is a good idea?
Higher?
Next question. Do you believe the Sound Transit Board should change from an appointed board of city and county officials to a directly elected one? Are you going to advance affordable housing? So I'm going to start with Jesse. And your question is, how will you address our homelessness crisis if you become mayor?
My animating principle behind the homelessness crisis is that housing is a human right, and that it is our job as a progressive community to reach a hand out and to help those among us who are vulnerable and housing vulnerable. So it is a complex issue, and it has both short-term solutions around keeping people safe in the very near term, and then longer-term issues that are very deeply related to our mental health crisis and related to our affordability crisis. So first, on the very short term, I believe that we need to take action urgently to make sure that people are safe as we are heading into, not this rainy season because I won't be mayor yet, but as we're moving into the next rainy season. And to me, that looks like an approach that is including sanctioned encampments that have services there. So, for example, public safety services, mental health services, sanitation services. We need an approach that leverages the energy around tiny homes, that uses the business community and the labor community and government to help fund those. And finally, we need to work regionally to open more shelter beds. I am proud to be endorsed by mayors like Mayor Strickland in Tacoma, Claudia Balducci in Bellevue. We have a regional problem. Secondly, we need to address the affordability crisis. People are homeless because it is hard to live in this city. And so we need an affordability plan that reaches across the city, that doesn't leave any neighborhood off the hook, and uses a whole array of affordability tools, from rental supports to increased density and private sector housing where we're asking developers to pay, but also mother-in-law apartments and other tools that we have to increase the housing supply and supports. Finally, we need to invest in our mental health system. We know that there's been disinvestment since the Reagan administration, and things like the opioid crisis, which require both prevention and safe treatment right now, are things that we need to be investing in to make sure that we're taking care of the people who live among us. Homeless.
Oh no. Okay.
Who is less deserving of the city of Seattle's efforts? Homeless children or homeless men? That just seems difficult. It's a difficult decision. And it's really a question of priority. So, I didn't come up with this question, but it was submitted to me.
That's okay. I'm a politician, I guess we'll work through it. The fundamental question is dealing with the issue of homelessness, and there are many causes Justin talked about for homelessness. But the first rule of taking the problem on is keeping people in their homes first. Half the people over 55 were homeless, are homeless because they just couldn't afford the rent anymore, because their fixed incomes. They live largely in the outlying areas, more or less. This is a racial justice issue because in the South Seattle area, for instance, that's the only place that people of color could buy homes back in the day. And those people are now retired on fixed incomes. So when we start pyramiding property tax on top of property tax on top of sales tax increases, we're literally pricing people out of their homes. So the first rule of thumb is let's not do that anymore and keep pricing, pyramiding taxes on top of each other. Second thing, though, is that beyond all of the different behavioral health issues that need to be addressed, the real fundamental problem about housing costs is that there's not enough supply of housing units to meet the demand. Way more people want to live in Seattle than there are places to stay. So I believe we really need to take a serious look at giving significant resources to increasing the public housing supply that's owned by the public. So I have a plan to finance that through a publicly owned municipal bank that will drastically increase our capacity to finance tremendous housing construction so that we can actually meet the need of the supply and keep the inflationary costs down. So the publicly owned bank is an amazing thing. If we capitalize it with, say, $100 million, out of the $1.5 billion that the city has socked away in treasury bonds, that $100 million leverages out to $1 billion worth of construction capacity. Think of the housing we could provide with that.
Will the city retain police officers in schools to function as non-uniform resource officers with proper training in restorative justice, or fund schools to provide their own specialists to work as true resource officers? Though it's a yes or no question, I think it gets to policing in school.
Terrific. It's a great question, and I think that there's not a one-size-fits-all solution. I think we have to realize that, number one, I know when I was U.S. Attorney that police officers face one of the toughest jobs there is in the city. And that's why police reform was not just about how officers use force, but it was about making their jobs safer for them. When we started the investigation into police conduct, we wanted to look at data. As mayor, I'm going to be very data-driven when we look at some issues like homelessness. And one of the things we found out from the Seattle Police Department's own data was that 75% of the time that an officer used force, they used it against someone who was either in mental health crisis or under the influence of drugs and alcohol. We have retooled how all of that training is done. So every police officer has additional training on crisis intervention. Every dispatch person has additional training on crisis intervention so that we can de-escalate those situations. 2 years later, that number has been driven down to a fraction. And so when we look at police officers in the schools, we have to look at what's the need we're trying to serve. I think it's a dual need. Number one, there's a social justice issue to make sure that schools have resources to help divert kids from the criminal justice system. That's the number one thing we want to do when we're talking about criminal justice in the schools. We have to stop that pipeline in so many parts of the city where kids end up in the criminal justice system and then their lot in life is decided. And so we need police officers in schools sometimes because they're good examples, they can work with kids, they can mentor them, but other schools may decide that different resources are there to do it. So I think that we have to, it's not a one-size-fits-all, but I think it's very important to send the message that for kids, really we need to give them the resources, pre-K, K, all through schools, so that they are able to be contributing to our society, and I'm going to talk later about apprenticeship programs.
Thank you. We're going to do another round of questions, except you'll only have 30 seconds to answer. If passed, the proposed city income tax will cost every taxpayer approximately $40 to file, even if you don't qualify. How do you propose to mitigate this problem?
Okay, question around income tax. I'm not sure about the premise of that question around it will cost each one of us $40, so we're going to put that aside, and I would want to do more homework on that specific assertion. What I will say generally is that we have an upside-down tax system where it does not reflect our values in this city, where the poorest among us, middle-class people, are shouldering the burden, and instead of the wealthiest and wealthy corporations who aren't paying their fair share, and fundamentally I think all of us believe that we are in this together. And so the idea around an income tax is something we need to explore, and I support it. That was 30 seconds.
How will you encourage an inclusive culture in our city, even for Republicans?
Well, a little known fact is I actually am the most successful senator in the Senate, state Senate right now. Last year I passed more bills than any other member of the Senate. And it is because I work well across the aisle. So we disagree on so many things, but the trick is to find out areas where you do agree on. So I was able to pass, for instance, racial impact statements, which is amazing, where we can get predictions on how the legislation we're going to be passing will have detrimental effects against communities of color.
Give a snapshot of your vision of Seattle in 25 years, and how will we get there?
Great question. If my mom was born and raised here, I was born and raised here. If you dropped her down in Seattle, she wouldn't recognize it. I won't recognize in 20 years what my kids will be living here. I want a city that has as eclectic neighborhoods as we have today. They will be different. I think if you held a gun to some people said you have to move from West Seattle to Capitol Hill, you'd say, no way. We have to have transit and developments around transit so those areas become neighborhoods and are vibrant and every kind of person lives there. Diversity of race, equity, how they live, how they work, so that we are the rich, beautiful Seattle that I love.
Blue slips of paper time. A little blue slips. And again, one candidate.